Thanks for coming, everyone. Um, First, I want to thank Kim and Katan for inviting me to do this. I really need a reason to talk about Vertigo, so if anyone wants to hang around afterward and talk to me about Vertigo, I'd be happy to do that. The other thing I will say as well is I've never spoken about Vertigo in less than about 90 minutes. So I have been killing myself trying to figure out how to communicate what this film means to me in about sort of 15 to 20 minutes. So that's been a real challenge, but sort of interesting, and I'm hoping that I'm all the more provocative for dropping a lot of material out of what I might normally say. One thing I'll say about Vertigo at the outset is I think it's a film ultimately about obsession, right? Desire and obsession, and I think it's the great film in the history of Hollywood that teaches us to live through very private, obsessive fantasies. And so I suppose in some sense that's where Vertigo's resonance is with me. I think Vertigo allows me to explore my own obsession with that film, but I think to some degree the kinds of obsessions we all explore through cinema. And I guess one thing I want you to think about as I'm talking about Vertigo is to think about cinema not as something that is pure entertainment, if you want to call it that, or a diversion, or just something we casually do, but that cinema actually obsesses us in really profound ways. And I think Vertigo is, there are sort of 3 or 4 films that I would say deeply disturb me when I watch them. And I've seen Vertigo, let's say, more than 20 times. Each time that I watch it, it's so profoundly disturbing because I think it questions my deepest values. And if I can get to something like that by the end of the talk, I'll be sort of happy. Just for me to get my own bearings, who's seen Vertigo? Okay, look, almost everyone, great. Who's seen it twice? Pretty good. The reason I ask that is because Vertigo is one of the very interesting films where there's a fundamental distinction between seeing it the first time and seeing it any time after that. And I think the distinction stems from this astonishing woman. What I want to say about this shot, if you see the film the first time, then I think you see this Kim Novak figure as something of an innocent, right? She hasn't done anything wrong. And at this scene in Ernie's restaurant, Scotty, this is not quite a point of view shot, but it's close to a point of view shot. Scotty watches her, and we take her to be something of an innocent. She has not intruded on anybody. And she, as far as we know, is completely unaware of what's going on. But if you've seen the film a second time, then of course you know that she's not quite as innocent as she seems. And she's performing just as much as Scotty is performing his own sort of invisibility sitting at the bar. So I guess I do want to make a point about this. I'm going to speak to some degree as if you've seen the film. Okay, so I'm not going to be able to devolve too much into story and plot. I'm also going to try to encourage you to see it a second time if you've only seen it once, because I think it's one of the great rewarding experiences seeing the film a second time. But even if you haven't seen it, I'm going to anchor everything I say in a clip, which goes for 2 minutes, and a couple of images that I've taken from the film. And I think those images and that one clip sort of speaks to not only the essence of Vertigo, which is a tough movie to discover the essence of, but I think to some degree the essence of everything that Hitchcock does in the 1950s. Vertigo is truly the great expression of Hitchcock's sort of psychopathological hang-ups that you see in Rear Window, Vertigo, Psycho, The Birds, Marnie, etc. Okay, and I've written here, for example, that, look, in my reading of Vertigo, I never see this woman as Madeline or Judy. I always see her as a very complex configuration of Madeline, Judy, Mrs. Gavin Alster, Carlotta Valdez, and you can add to that Midge as well. Midge, perhaps one of the really problematic figures in Vertigo. So I'll speak to an audience who's to some degree seen it, but if you haven't, I'll show a clip, and I think that will sort of galvanize a lot of it. Okay, what prompted this, my thinking on this, is simply because of a landmark moment that took place last year, 2012. The most respected by far film poll in the world. It's a UK film poll. It comes from Sight and Sound, which is a very influential journal/magazine. And they run a poll that only appears once every decade. So it's not even a yearly or sort of a biannual poll. And in 2012, you'll note here that Vertigo gets the #1 spot. What's astonishing about that is that Citizen Kane had the #1 spot since 1962, right? And who's seen Citizen Kane, by the way? So, great. This is obviously a very cinephitic audience. Citizen Kane has a kind of stature. If I asked you what Rosebud was, everybody would know, right? Citizen Kane has this stature, I think, not only aesthetically and historically, but in a sense of wider culture. We kind of know what that movie is. But Vertigo is much more problematic. I think Vertigo will divide this audience dramatically. You know, I've spoken to lots of people and I've taught Vertigo many, many times. Vertigo is one of those films that divides audiences. Some will love it, some will find it endlessly frustrating and therefore will never return to it. Where Citizen Kane is just considered the great masterpiece. The point I want to make here is that this is for the first time that Vertigo appears #1. And the title of this talk, which I suggested as Vertigo, the greatest film ever made, because I'm giving the talk, yes, it is the greatest film ever made, but as a stronger substantiation, if you're into polls, and Sight and Sound is a particularly good one, this is a collection of criticism. Critics, for the most part, in the UK, the US, and throughout Europe. And I expect that Vertigo will remain at the top for quite a long time. There's a sort of ground shift from Citizen Kane to Vertigo. Citizen Kane, while somewhat transgressive and quite radical for a number of things, is nowhere near as problematic, I think, as a film as Vertigo, and I'll come back to why I think that's the case. Okay, I'll show the clip in a second, but I want to frame my discussion of that clip. So, look, I can't communicate everything this film means to me. If you're in, I'd love to chat to you further about it. But I'm going to focus on one thing, and it's a claim. I'm going to claim that Vertigo is the greatest love story in the history of certainly Hollywood, right? And look, I adore The Apartment, Billy Wilder's movie, and I love Woody Allen's Manhattan, but Vertigo's the great, great love story. And the reason I say that is because it seems to me that Vertigo is great precisely because we expect love stories to be quite straightforward, to be heterosexual, to encode very clear relationship lines between the man and the woman. It usually ends in some kind of consummation, almost always a marriage. Think about the ending to Rear Window, a couple of years before Vertigo. You know, kind of playful, and we could debate the ending to Rear Window as well. But it seems to me that at the end of that film, what is promised us is that both Jeff and Lisa are going to be okay because ultimately the whole movie was about them getting married. It really wasn't about catching a killer, it was about getting married. And catching a killer enables that marriage to take place, which is a foundational position in Hollywood. Vertigo is great precisely because it doesn't do that. And the claim I want to make is that it's the darkest, most perverse film ever made in Hollywood. All the way through its golden years from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, nothing again approaches Vertigo just as a film about perversion of all sorts. The great film theorist Peter Walden argues that if you watch Scotty close enough in Vertigo, from first frame to last, Scotty pretty much exhibits every psychopathological problem you can imagine, including necrophilia. And Peter Walden, in fact, claims that the only thing Scotty really wants in Vertigo is to have sex with a dead woman. That's really what underscores this entire film, and it's a really provocative argument that I think can be argued quite strongly. My take on perversion in Vertigo comes from this. If, like me, you've seen the film, maybe more than once, and if you find yourself identifying with Scotty, played by James Stewart, I think the film forces you into that identification. Think about all the scenes where we follow in the footsteps of Scotty, we drive through the streets of San Francisco, we see everything he sees, we are the kind of voyeurs that Scotty is. if you accept that point of identification, then you are accepting a position that, for me, is fundamentally perverse and quite deviant from the norm of a heterosexual love story in Hollywood. And the reason I say that is because the film deceives us into thinking that, in fact, this is conventional. I think we, on some level, desire that Scotty and Madeline wind up together, right? That when he discovers Judy, they will, again, I'm assuming you've seen the film, when Judy comes back into the movie, they will fall in love. And things will work out for them. Bear in mind, this is James Stewart, right? James Stewart's an all-American guy. If you've seen, It's a Wonderful Life, he's George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life. So we anticipate that there'll be some kind of resolution, some kind of closure. Instead, what we get is anything but that kind of closure, anything but that affirmation that things will work out in the end for Scotty. And I want to locate that in one sequence that I'm going to show you, and then a couple of images. And I'm going to suggest that what you're in fact watching is a subject position or way of viewing the world that is in fact really unsettling. If you wish to inhabit that space of Scotty in this movie, I hope you find it as confronting as I do when I watch the scenes. Great. Okay, so this is a scene. Just to set the framework, Scotty has been, he's romanced Madeline. She has died. He doesn't know it's a plot that's been set up by Gavin Alster, Madeline's husband. He then goes to an institution because he suffered a complete nervous breakdown. He comes out of the institution. He miraculously, first few days out of the institution, runs into a woman who not only looks like Madeline, but in fact is played by Kim Novak. And he spends the next few days making over this woman. He's going to dress her like Madeline because he's so in love with Madeline. And it all culminates in this one scene, right? This is, if you will, this is the point of closure for the spectator. This is Scotty finally discovering his love object. Okay. That's, I think, one of the great moments in Hitchcock's career. A very elaborate, lavish camera move. 360 moves around the bodies of the two lovers. As I suggested before, this is a very recognizable, familiar trope of cinema, especially of Hollywood, right? The lovers have to get together. They'll kiss, or there'll be some kind of consummation of this love. And Hitchcock's going to emphasize it with this dramatic camera move. So we get the rise of the music, there's a sort of crescendo, there's something almost sort of beautifully transcendent in this coming together of the two lovers, and we see that throughout Hitchcock's career, but you also see it in the other great Hollywood filmmakers. And if you look at movies of the 30s, for example, it's such a staple trope of movies of the 30s and early 40s. But I guess my question to you is, how would you read this scene? Particularly if you know Vertigo quite well, you know where it goes from here. On the one hand, I can read it in that quite conventional way. Scotty is in some ways cured through his rediscovery of Madeline. And there's something quite beautiful about that. But I think we all know that that's in fact a problematic reading. There's in fact something horribly wrong with what just happened. And this is what's wrong with it. Scotty is not interested in this woman at all. Right? That woman need not be in the room. This is such a profoundly obsessive, narcissistic love that I could remove the woman from the frame and the scene would be even more profound, it seems to me. So note that when the camera does a 360, it gets about halfway, and it's tough to see with the lights, but you just see that the room sort of dissolved, and where we entered was a projection of Scotty's mind. And the film has two options here. And I'm going to make a really crude generalization. One option, if we take the classical Hollywood route, Scotty realizes that what he's seen is really not the woman that he's in love with. And that's really an apparition. He realizes it, and he tries to pull himself out of it. That would be a very classical position, because it would affirm for us as the audience that our protagonist knows the distinction between what's real and what isn't real. But Hitchcock does something much more problematic and much more profound, which is that Scotty pauses, he looks around him, he looks at something that, one, isn't there, two, that Judy doesn't see, and he completely embraces that apparition. And I guess for me, what is most beautiful about Vertigo is that I can watch a film like this and identify with a protagonist that so fully gives himself over to purely an obsession. Not a conventional, wholesome, nourishing love, but the obsession of, in a very simple way, being in love with yourself. Being so profoundly narcissistic and just accepting that. And it seems to me that's the kind of obsession that Hitchcock brings us with Vertigo, and that is, it's going to contaminate, and I mean that in the best way, the cinema of people like Kubrick. Think about a film like Eyes Wide Shut. Eyes Wide Shut is just for me, I adore that film. It's a neat continuation of Vertigo, right? But I find its source in this moment. Think about Lynch, Mulholland Drive. I don't know if you can see this image. This is the essence of Vertigo right there. What is a woman to a man? She's just a ghost. She's a ghostly figure. And really what he's interested in is really much more primarily himself. And I think that's such a powerful moment in Hitchcock cinema. I threw this, I'm just going to wrap up really fast. Oh, I'm going to wrap up really fast. That's Scotty falling apart in a sort of psychosis. And that's a shot I just took, I clipped at the end of the film, and notice there Hitchcock's very deliberate in the postures of the body. So this is where Scotty of that scene you just saw is headed. There's so much debate about how to read the ending of Vertigo. I've never understood that. That's the ending of Vertigo. This is a person who stares into an abyss, and there's nothing else. There's just the contemplation of an abyss. I'll end just quickly by... This is a screenshot in Mulholland Drive. After the two women have made love in that scene, and you can't see it, but it's Lynch's sort of cubist representation of the woman. You can't see it, but their lips are joined up, and one's out of focus and one's front shot in focus. And I guess what I want to suggest here is this is the woman that I think we see to some degree coming at us through Vertigo, and that will continue to populate the cinemas of, the great modernist filmmakers, Kubrick, Antonioni, to some degree, contemporaries that we see, someone like Michael Haneke, for example. It seems to me this woman that is so critical to Vertigo is going to reappear. And she doesn't fit classical Hollywood. She fits what comes after classical Hollywood. And to think that this is a Hollywood movie of the late 50s. I think I'll end it there. Thanks very much.